right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Carolyn Gregoire, Tricycle contributor and journalist, and I'm happy to be here with you today for Awakening with Koans, a conversation with Joan Sutherland. So we'll be leaving some time for questions at the end of this hour-long session. You can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. Today's Zoom session will be recorded and we'll send out the replay link and a follow-up email tomorrow. So my guest today is Joan Sutherland Roshi. Sutherland is the author of Through Forests of Every Color, Awakening with Koans, which is coming out with Shambhala next month, an original, intimate, spiritual, and literary journey through the world of koans. She was the co-founder of the Pacific Zen School and founder of the Open Source, a network of Dharma communities in the Western US. She now lives on the coast of Northern California, focused on writing and translating from classical Chinese. Cloud Dragon, the Joan Sutherland Dharma Works, disseminates her work. Welcome, Joan. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. It's good to be here.
So your book is a really beautiful, rich, and kind of multi-dimensional journey through the world of koans. And you explore koans as a spiritual practice, an art form, a way of life, and a way to engage more directly with life's mysteries. I'd love to kick things off by having you read a short selection from your book.
Sure. And I thought we could start with maybe bringing some koans into the room, or more accurately, acknowledging the koans that are already in the room. So these are just a few koans to begin with. And the first is something that Yunmen said. See how vast and wide the world is. Why do you put on your clothes when the morning bell rings? See how vast and wide the world is. Why do you put on your clothes when the morning bell rings? And a lot of the koans are really about that relationship between the vast and wide world and the activities of our ordinary lives. And what is their relationship? What do they have to do with each other? And then there are a lot of times people will ask, well, what is Chan or Zen? And I should probably just say at the outset that the koans began in Chinese Buddhism in the school of meditation that's called Chan. And that word is pronounced Zen in Japanese. And that's the word that some people are more familiar with. But one is the Chinese version and one is the Japanese version of that school. Okay, so in China, someone would ask, what is this school of ours? And the answer is snow in a silver bowl. And then a while later in Japan, someone asked basically the same question, what is Zen? And the answer was, the heart of the one who asks is Zen. And that particular heart belonged to a woman who was lost in grief and had come to a monastery looking for some kind of solace from that grief. And so that answer, the heart of the one who asks is Zen, is really saying your grief is not a problem you came here to solve. Your grief is the Buddha of this time. And what does that mean? And she spent some time there exploring that question. And so then some koans are arresting images that grab us. And there's something interesting about them, tantalizing maybe sometimes, but we can't quite grasp it. And so there's an invitation to come into relationship. And one such koan is, the stone woman gives birth in the middle of the night. The stone woman gives birth in the middle of the night. And then the last koan I wanted to mention was one that probably most people know, which is, what is the sound of one hand? And Carolyn, you'd mentioned that in the announcement for our meeting. And so I thought I would start with just a little excerpt from my commentary on the sound of one hand from the book. So the book has a lot of different voices in it, and one of them is their interspersed koans and commentaries on them. So this is a little bit from the commentary on the sound of one hand. If people know only one koan, it's probably this one. There's no clapping in this koan, despite what's often said in English. A literal translation would be something like, one of a pair of hands makes a sound. Hear that sound. This is a little clunky in English, so we simplify. What is the sound of one hand clapping is a riddle rather than a koan. But what is the sound of one hand is a night sky of a question, a prairie wind of a question, a bottomless well of a question. When I first sat with this koan, I'd sense a hand coming over my left shoulder and then down in front of me, taking me down with it to the place it disappeared. There is a vast silence held in the palm of the one hand. And then after a while, there are more questions. What is the sound of the hand at the top of the tallest building near you? In a stranger's raised fist at a protest? The sound of the hand of the air you're breathing, of the light or the shadow you're sitting in, of the rhythmic clatter of a subway train? The sound of the hand of your meditation, clenched, open? Once you've heard the sound, what will you do with it? Questions like these are asked in koan study as a way of helping you articulate and deepen your understanding. So then I thought we could go back and pick up the sort of origin story of the koans and give that as a foundation for us to go from. And again, this mentions Chan, which is the Chinese school of meditation. Koan study emerged in Chan about 1,000 years ago. The scholar Jinhua Jia describes Chan's shift in emphasis as one from pacifying, cultivating, and contemplating the mind to letting the mind be free. Koan introspection, as this new practice came to be called, was transmitted through East and Southeast Asia, particularly Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, and from there it has spread to many parts of the world. It's been in North America for less than 100 years. This is a living tradition, evolving through eras, landscapes, and cultures. The koans have always pulled for the particular genius of each new group of people who take them up. In the beginning, Chan teachers and students were having conversations during which one or more of the participants would have an opening. Then they discovered that if other people who could be quite distant in time and space brought the story of that conversation into their meditation, they could experience the same thing the participants in the original conversation had. Not a lesson or even an understanding about awakening, but awakening itself. Records of these conversations were the first koans. Pretty soon, teachers were trying out bits of poems and songs, quotes from scriptures, common sayings, and folk tales, borrowing from both classical literature and popular culture, and the same thing continued to happen. How it happens is the dark mysterious of the koan tradition.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that gets to the most foundational question, which is, what is a koan? How could we define such a thing?
Well, I tried to do, to give it its historical background there. And really, that's a question that keeps evolving. I mean, koans don't stand still, and they keep opening out and out and out. So when I was teaching and I was doing a koan seminar, I would always, because I was going to be asking people to talk about what they thought about koans, I would always say, this is what I'm thinking about this week with koans. And so I'll give you that answer. I'll give you the answer of what I'm thinking about this week with koans, which is, actually, I'll mention two things. And one is that koans are a stream of questioning, a stream of inquiry that's been going on for much longer than the formal koan tradition. And they're a way of allowing us to take our personal questions, the questions that we carry next to our skin, the ones that are really important to us, what the tradition calls the great matter for each of us, to take our personal question and drop it into this stream that's been going on forever, and notice how our question changes when we do that, in the sense that the koans say, your question is a question that people have been asking for a very long time in a lot of different ways. And here are some of the ways that that question has been held by people and wondered about by people. And what happens to your question when you drop it into that stream? How does it change? What do you understand about your question in a slightly different way? So that's one way. And another is, I've really been coming to see some koans, not all of them, but the current in that koan stream that I'm particularly interested in as being really kind of questions that the earth is asking through human lives. Mm-hmm. And that feels so important right now, because I care very much about how the koans might be a practice for this time, and for this time of particularly of climate crisis and mass extinction and pandemic and all of that. And so this idea that the questioning goes even deeper than human history, but is something rising up out of the earth, and it rises through human heart minds and takes the shape of its life inside humans. How might that help us to get a little closer, get a little bit more intimate with some of the really deep questions that we're facing as a species on this planet?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I want to delve into koans for this time and the climate crisis a little later in the conversation. But to start, what does it look like what does it mean to practice with a koan? Like, there's different ways of understanding that. Is it a contemplation? Is it meditation? Something different altogether?
Yes, all of the above. So the thing I call koan practice keeping company with koans, and the sense of that is that you live with a koan for as long as the relationship lasts, which for some koans is your whole life. And in that keeping company, yes, you bring it into your meditation, and there are ways of koan meditation, which was called koan introspection in the past, that are specific to koan meditation, that are different from other forms. It's not a silent meditation, for instance. You actually say the koan and you watch what happens, what the interaction between the koan and your own heart mind is. And then there are times, obviously, of silence where you and the koan just fall into the silence together, and you are having a relationship of a different kind in the silence. So there's the meditation part of it, but there's also the walking around part. You live with it, you take it with you. I've got a section in the book called Koans to Carry in Your Pocket, which are easy koans to take with you. And you ask it everywhere. You ask it all day long, and you ask it in different situations, and you go to sleep with it. And some people find that they can actually take the koan into their sleep and their dreaming, and you wake up with it. And so that's when you're keeping company with a particular koan. But when you're living life with the koans, they'll often arise in the course of a day. Something will happen and a koan will come to mind, or you'll read a koan or come across a koan, and it will come to fetch you. It will come to get you, because suddenly it's indispensable, whereas a moment before you didn't even know it. And then you live with that in the same kind of way. So you bring all of your life to the koan, and you bring the koan into all of your life, and see what happens. And so if you're in formal koan study, there may come a time that you are going to present a response to your teacher, but that's just part of the process. There's so much else that's going on, and you will notice things arise in your life. Things come clear in your life. Things fall away in your life that you might not even associate with the koan in the beginning, but you begin to see that the koan is acting in your life in all kinds of different ways.
It's so fascinating, these ways that the koan works on you over time. And something you talk about in the book that was new to me is how to actually craft koans out of the circumstances of your own life. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny to me because that's where koan started, right? Koan started in the circumstances of people's lives. They were conversations that people were actually having for the first time, and then they became koans. And when koans traveled from China to Japan, the Chinese teachers who came with the koans had some difficulty at first because most Japanese people didn't have a lot of familiarity with the Chinese philosophical texts and the language and stuff, and so they couldn't really use the books and the sources they were used to using, and so they developed in the moment Zen, which was using purely Japanese moments, what was happening right then, as koans, and the tradition was revived in that way. And so in some ways we're doing kind of the same thing, where we're noticing how the koans enter and flavor our lives and what we pick up as koans. And so one of my most delightful projects is looking at Western literature and looking at the koans that might be there. And if you'd like, we could talk about that, or we could talk about sort of walking around with koans. What would you like to do?
Yeah, I'd love to hear an example from Western literature.
Okay. So the French poet Paul Eluard said, "There is another world, but it is inside this one. There is another world, but it is inside this one." And each of us will have our own experience of that. But one of the things I think that koan, it is a koan, I've made it, it's a koan. One of the things that koan points to is this sense that there are the habits of our daily lives, our ordinary lives, and there's a feeling sometime that those lives contain a lot of limitation and restriction, and that we're looking for something more spacious and more at ease. And he's saying, it's here, it's inside your life, it's inside this ordinary life. And I've come to feel that the most important word in that in the koan is but. There is another world, but it is inside this one, not somewhere else, not far away, not transcendent, not some shining reality, but right here, softly glowing inside the world as it is. There is this other world. And there's the promise that we can touch that world and over time see that world all the time as we're looking at the ordinary things around us in our lives. And then more recently, again, I've been thinking about another sense of that koan, which is there is another world, which is the old world, the world that is under threat right now because of the environmental crises that we're dealing with. But that world is still there, and it's still calling to us. So there is another world, and it is still inside this one that we are making and this one that we are destroying. And how can we see that, touch that, connect with that, stay in touch, stay intimate with that world through the layers of the worlds we're making around it.
Thank you for sharing that. And this might be a nice time to talk about how koans can be used in a time of crises like the ones that we're experiencing right now. And you wrote a beautiful piece about how koans arose in a time of great uncertainty and difficulty and upheaval. And so how were koans used then, and how can we apply them now to really meet the moment of challenging that we're in as a culture?
Yeah. So koans have always been both solace and inspiration in hard times. And They inspire us to act, and they give us the solace of a very big view that helps us act even in hard times. And as you mentioned, the first conversations that became koans came from a time in Chinese history right after the Anlushan rebellion, when the Tang dynasty kind of fell apart and there was famine and disease and rebellion. And it was a terrible decade when 2/3 of the Chinese population died. So that's a pretty big cataclysm, that really is. And one of the foundational teachers in Chinese Buddhism was a man called I call the great horse ancestor, who was ancestor Ma. And he spent 20 years walking through that landscape, walking through the devastated landscape after the Anlushan rebellion before settling down to teach. And then when he taught, it was with that experience of 20 years of walking through it. So koans really, they're not separate from life. They're not an escape from life. They are really a way of first of all, deconstructing whatever gets between us and life, and then helping us become intimate with that life, whatever it is. And Ma and Shito, the other great teacher of his time, they lifted the eyes of Chan from a kind of, what we would call today like navel gazing, a kind of like interior look for our true nature. And they said, look around you, everything you see is you. This self, this true self that you're looking for, it's everywhere around you. And they meant in the devastation, in the difficulty, it's that too. That is you, and you are that. And so that was in it from the beginning, and all the way through its history. Koans were part of people trying to come up to the great crises of their day. One of my favorite stories about that, which I don't include in the book actually, is the story of Tokimune, who was the regent in Japan when they were waiting for the Khan of the Mongolian people to invade Japan. And for years they had sentries on the beaches waiting for the ships to come. And finally word came that the ships had come, and he was in charge of the defense of Japan against the navy that had come. And one of the things I love is that when he got the word that the Mongols had arrived, he went not to his generals, but to his Zen teacher. And he said this thing that moves me so much. He said, the great thing has arrived. Mm-hmm. And his teacher asked a surprising question. Is there any way you can avoid it? And the answer was obvious. No, there is no way I can avoid it. And he went off, and in fact, the invasion never happened, and Japan was spared that. And then afterwards, Tokimune built a monument to the dead of both sides. And that whole thing seems a very koan story to me, in that it's a way of coming right up against life, just pressing right up against life and responding to what needs to be responded to, and also holding this really big view where he could make a monument to all the dead, no sides in that at all. So there are many, many stories like that through the koans, which I could tell, but you could read the book, and you could read those stories that are about how the koans get used in these very real ways. And it's one of the reasons I will push against the idea of koans as riddles. There ain't much realer than fighting off an invasion of your country, as the Ukrainians are finding out right now. Nothing much realer than that. That's no riddle. That's real life. And also that they're just kind of dharma combats. They're just contests. They're just a kind of ritualized performance of certain kinds of responses that involve shouting and hitting and things like that. They're not. They're about our intimacy with life and our capacity to respond in the ways that are needed in any given situation.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And what was it that brought you to koans in as you originally sort of came to them, and how has your work with them evolved over the 50 years, I think almost, that you've been studying and teaching?
Yeah, I first came across koans when I was a teenager, and I thought, gosh, those are great. And I didn't understand them. I didn't really have any sense of them at all. And the resources 50 years ago weren't very plentiful. But it did lead me to go to university and study Chinese and Japanese so that I could read the koans in the original. And when I was there, I had a graduate seminar of one with a teacher who we were translating koans together. And I came to see that he was teaching me their mind, as much as he was teaching me their grammar or their vocabulary. And then I did a kind of long trip through other forms of Zen, other forms of Buddhism, spent a little time in Tibetan Buddhism, and ended up back with the koans in my late 30s, and just felt that I had come home, that was my home. And I studied with John Tarrant at what became Pacific Zen Institute, did my study there. And I can't really explain it except in terms of sort of fate and inevitability. It doesn't, there didn't seem to be any choice involved. It just seemed to be what happened.
Yeah, something I found really interesting about your background too is that you've explored koans as sort of a communal or a group practice. You say in the book at one point that your sangha is dreaming koans together, and I know you've held these koan salons. What does it look like to have a group koan practice, and how can the group support the work with koans?
Yeah, so after a while, I ended up moving to Santa Fe, New Mexico for a while, and there was a community there that gathered around this work. And we were a very, very close community. And one of the things I really wanted to explore was koans as a community practice, not just as an individual practice. Most of us, during the time I was training, we have more Chan now in the West than we did when I was training. It was mostly through Japanese schools, and Japan had taken koans pretty much into individual work, and that's what we inherited. And so it was very much a solitary practice. And in fact, you didn't talk about your practice, and you didn't even say that you were working with koans, and it was just you and the teacher. But the Chinese, in the Chinese origins of the koans, people talked about koans in groups all the time. I mean, that's the original koans are these conversations that happened in front of other people. So I was interested. So I'll just do a little parenthetical thing and say that many of the things that look like innovations are actually a return to the earliest roots of the koan tradition. So we were living it all the time. And one of the ways we did that was that in retreats, for example, we would wake up in the middle of the night and come into the hall and sit so that we could remember our dreams and sit with our dreams. In the mornings, we would tell our dreams, and nobody would comment, and people were very good about being very sparse about their reports. But you could begin to see, because people were willing to share their dreams, the images and the themes that were moving underground in a retreat. And if we hadn't done that, no one, there would have been no other way to know that. And that was quite rich to see that everybody was having their individual experience, and there was also a group experience that was happening at the same time. And we spent every retreat, we would have at least one evening where we spent talking about koans together. And I mentioned at one point in the book this feeling of the kind of the low light of an evening in the meditation hall, and people beginning to toss the koan from person to person to person, and the kind of filaments of light that you could see connecting people as they toss the koan. And so in the koan salon, which was the innovation of that time, we actually took koans out of the meditation hall into someone's living room. We met once a week, and we had these wonderful conversations among people who knew a lot about koans and people who knew nothing about koans but were interested in them. And they were often artists. That it often attracted a lot of artists, also people who were doing various kinds of activism. And we would just have these conversations that could start anywhere and go anywhere. And after a while, people started to talk about how it was as if we were learning a new language together, and that we weren't making an institution, we were creating a culture. And as we learned the language of the koans together, there was the culture of that language was coming into being around us. And that was an extraordinary experience in my life. I feel very privileged to have done that.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I want to, first of all, encourage all of our participants, if you have a question, feel free to drop it into the Q&A tab. We'll be getting to those shortly. But I want to pick up on a strand you touched on there, which is the dreams. And you make some interesting connections between koans and dream practices in the book that I never would have expected. Could you speak to how we work with koans in different states of consciousness?
Yeah, so one of the main shifts that I alluded to when I was talking about the origins of the koans in Chan is this shift from an idea that the self is a problem, and the way to deal with the problem of the self is to manage it and discipline it and pare it down. That had been kind of the, largely the viewpoint from Indian Buddhism and then in early Chinese Buddhism. And the Koan said, we have a different hunch about that. And that hunch is, let's go the other way. Instead of using a self to manage a self, which is what they would call that kind of activity, let's just expand out the sense of the self so large that whatever your habitual limitations, whatever shell you put around the self just gets broken open, and the self becomes so vast that it disappears in the opposite way. Instead of getting smaller, it gets so big that it has no meaning as a particular habitual self anymore. And that's part of what the koans do when they throw you into the lives and the bodies of all these different beings. I mean, when you do koans, you're old teacher of the Tang Dynasty, and you're a donkey, and you're a wild fox, and you learn what the partridges know about spring, and what wild fox doubt is, and all these different things. So all of that is you, and of course, in some sense, not you as well. And in the same way, instead of managing states of consciousness and refining them, you just show that the distinctions we make between states of consciousness are maybe not as inevitable as we think they are. And so we talked before about bringing koans not only into meditation, but into your walking around life. So there's a breakdown. Your meditating state of mind and your walking around state of mind, are they different? What's the through line between them? And the koan tends to run in that through line. What's the through line between meditating and walking around and dreaming and sleeping? Yeah, there's a through line there too. And so it tends again to break down the ways we categorize things and limit them by exploding the differences, exploding the boundaries, and showing that there really is all one. There's one consciousness moving through these different expressions of that consciousness. Dreaming is an expression, waking life, meditation, they're all expressions. And then you begin to see that maybe dreaming and waking life are not so different after all, that they have a lot of things in common. And so you can look at koans as like dreams. It's not the only thing to do with koans, but it's one thing to kind of amplify them as you would with dreams. You can bring your dreams that you have while you're working with a koan into work in the room, and we can talk about that, because sometimes your dreaming life will have something to say about your koan that your waking life doesn't get to, and you learn something new about the koan. You can walk around in your waking life and you can ask, am I awake? Am I dreaming? How do I know? And so there's this constant mixing, because the point is not the individual state of consciousness. The point is the consciousness that is expressed in all these different kinds of states. And koans and dreams and mixing them up together are great ways of showing the continuities of those states of consciousness.
Yeah, thank you for that. And in the more in the Western sort of contemporary Zen tradition, I think often the koans are described as being used for the goal of kind of sparking instant awakening or enlightenment. Do you agree with that? Do you have a different perspective on the purpose of koan study and whether they lead to awakening?
Yeah, so one of the things I lay out is a kind of different roadmap for that. And koans have been associated with enlightenment, but enlightenment, is a little bit of a problematic word, because we tend to translate a lot of different words in different Asian languages that mean a lot of different things as enlightenment. So our idea of it is a little fuzzy. And then we have all of our sort of projections on it, and our yearnings and our hopes and what we think it is. And so what I talk about in the book is that there are some koans that are really good for bringing you to enlightenment. And I define enlightenment as a very specific thing, which is that it's an opening, a very profound opening into the sort of oneness of the world and the insubstantiality of the self. And that's part of the arc of awakening, but it's not the whole thing. And I think we have all seen examples of people who have had those kinds of experiences, and it doesn't seem to have touched their hearts, and it doesn't seem to have touched their character, and so that to me would be kind of proof that it's not the whole thing, it's a part of it. So I tend to think of every one of us having an arc of awakening that lasts at least our whole lifetime, maybe before that and maybe after that. There are these times of enlightening experience that are these profound insights that tend to be kind of, what we then know. The experiences that you have in an enlightening experience, no one can ever take away from you. You have that. At the same time, I think there is another process, which is the process of endarkenment, and that is as necessary as the process of enlightenment. If enlightenment is, really roughly speaking, about what we know, what we come to know, endarkenment is about what we know we can't know. So endarkenment is a kind of embrace of the great mystery at the center of everything, and a growing ease and comfort with that mystery. So that's don't know mind, which is an old Zen thing, writ, on the scale of the universe. And that's really important too, because we can know a lot, but there's most of what there is in any given moment we can't know. And to be aware of that, to be open to that, to take that into account really matters. And then another aspect of endarkenment is that it has, if enlightenment, tends to involve a mental kind of insight, a mind insight, endarkenment involves a kind of opening of the heart to the poignancy and the sorrows of the world, and an ability to press our own hearts up against the great broken heart of the world and be able to bear that and actually be able to respond to that. So big arc of our lives, which is idiosyncratic for every one of us, individual for every one of us, is awakening. And within that are moments and times and seasons and years of enlightenment, and moments and times and seasons and years of endarkenment. And always the bringing together of those kinds of experiences into our ordinary lives, into our everyday lives, and the mixing of all of that.
Yeah, beautifully said. Thank you for that. I know there was one more passage that you were going to share with us, and then we have quite a few questions, so I'd like to turn it over there.
Okay, great. Yeah, I thought before we go to questions, I would just go to the end of the book. And I should probably say that the book does have these various voices and parts. And so there are parts that, as you were mentioning, have to do with koans as art, as literature, as spiritual practice. There's a whole nitty-gritty section about how you literally sit, and lie down or walk around or whatever you do. So there's actual data here, folks. And then in the last part of the book, there are what happens in a life lived with koans. What does that look like over time? And I also address some of the things that have been missing from the koan tradition and some of the ways I'm thinking about it now. So from the very end, this is an excerpt from the chapter called Home. Every chapter has an epigraph, and this one is so beautiful that I'll read it. The moon shines on the river, wind stirs in the pines. Whose gift is this long, beautiful evening? And that's from Jungjia's Song of Realizing the Way. So this is some of Home. You might start out thinking that home is a distant destination, but it long ago drew near, waiting for you to notice. You might start out thinking that you're doing the searching, but everything is reaching out to everything, looking to find home in each other. This is what our call and response with the world is about, like fellow travelers in the mist, listening for each other, carrying the lanterns of home inside us. Or dolphins pinging one another and whales singing to each other across great distances in the murky seas. Even the delicate fingers of the vastness slowly peel back something delicate in you, layer by layer, looking to find home in you. The koans are for that too, holding you steady while the universe settles at the root of your breath. All of this is why awakening is called in Chinese, becoming intimate, becoming kin. I've long carried a story about a wedding kimono tucked under my robes next to my skin. A traditional Japanese countrywoman named Nanjo Sawako began sewing such a kimono for her daughter Naoko when she was still a little girl, as was the custom. But Nanjo Naoko didn't grow up to get married and settle down in their small village. She became an international photojournalist. She died covering the Afghan War of the 1980s. Her mother, who said she had hoped for a normal, common life for her daughter, who had never left her village before, heard a call and responded, adding a moment of extraordinary grace to the story of the world. She made the dangerous journey to the front lines in Afghanistan, carrying the kimono. She found her daughter's grave marked with a simple wooden stake and wrapped her body in the kimono. A mother blesses her daughter's life, even if it isn't the life she would have chosen for her, it isn't even a life she entirely understands. But it was her daughter's, and she gives it her blessing. She doesn't turn her love away from what is painful. Isn't this the ceremony that reveals the home in any moment? Even if this is not always the life I would have chosen for myself, even if I don't understand why some things have happened the way they have, it is mine, and I bless it. I bless this life that has been given into my care. It is home. This is such a deeply koan story to me, made of unknowing and love, mending even in sorrow, especially in sorrow, holding a question on a 4,000-mile journey as though the question itself were home.
Thank you. What a beautiful passage. I want to recommend that everyone pick up a copy of Joan's book if they'd like to hear more about koans and this tradition. So I'm going to turn it over to some questions. The first one, we hear that koans are not intellectual exercises. And this leads me to wonder whether the body has any role to play in the contemplation of a koan.
Yes, 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 absolutely. Thank you for the question. Sometimes people will talk about koans as though they're meant to subvert the rational, cognitive mind. They're meant to subvert our usual ways of thinking, and that's true. But that's just the beginning of something. It's kind of like kicking the rational mind aside for a moment, so that the rest of a person can show up. So that not just the mind, but the mind and the heart and the soul and the body and the imagination and the psyche and every part of oneself can come to meet the koan. And that's what that subversion of rational thinking is about, is exactly so that that the body can show up along with the psyche and the heart and everything else, and meet the koan and respond to it. And I'll just say parenthetically that as a teacher working in the room with people with koans, I've been told that the most unsettling words spoken during work in the room is "show me," because you can't just talk about a koan. You can't just give an answer. You have to show it with your whole self, which includes your body. And that kind of freedom of expression and really putting your whole self into it are very much an important part of it.
Yeah, well, a related question there. Dave asks, if koans are not riddles to be solved, why do some Zen teachers challenge students for answers?
Yeah, because there is a sense that there's something to learn here. There's something to come to understand. And again, it's in a koan, there's something for you to experience that is encoded in the koan. And a teacher will sometimes challenge you until you have that experience for yourself. But it's not about getting the right answer. And that again is another return to an older understanding of the koans, because in some of the Japanese traditions and some of the Western Zen traditions that were influenced by Japan, there are answers. There are books of answers, and you stay with the koan until you get that answer. And we don't work like that anymore. And it's not that those answers aren't important. They are. It's just that they don't necessarily illuminate the entire territory. And koans are about the mixing of the eternal world and a particular human life. And so everybody's going to express that in some different way. And what we found was that people could come to the traditional answers fairly easily, and then they would do these other things. There were these other things that were happening, and that seemed really important, because the answers we stopped calling them answers. The responses got bigger. But when a koan teacher is challenging you, it's to invite you to keep going until you have experienced that thing that is embodied in and encoded in the koan.
Yeah, thank you for that. And another participant asks, what koan has been your BFF over the years? Have you or the koan changed the most, or have you grown together?
It would be hard for me. I'm promiscuous with the koans. It would be hard for me to pick one BFF, because different koans light up at different times in one's life. Right now, I'm completely captured by that Paul Eluard quote. There is another world, but it is inside this one. And that's the one I'm living with. And so just to pick some that have really been important to me, the stone woman calls them back from their dream of the world, I would say. One that I know has been really important in my community is, fortunately, I am here to do it, which is the end of a story. Two people are talking and someone asks, what are you doing? And the other person says, I'm making tea for someone. And the first person says, well, why don't you get that person to make tea for themselves? And the person responds, fortunately, I am here to do it. And that's a really deep one. And I think the sound of one hand has always stayed with me from the very beginning. But in our curriculum, there were 750 koans, and we added a whole bunch more. So it's a it's a lot of relationship.
Many favorites.
Yes.
Wonderful. Annie says, thank you for this wonderful talk. And she's asking, what would you advise a person just starting with koans to start with?
To start with in the sense of what to do or what koan to start with? What?
It sounds like just how to get your feet wet with koans if you're not working with a formal teacher or formal practice.
Okay, well, I'll do a small plug for the book, because the book really is intended for people, whether they're working with a teacher or not, to be able to discover ways to come into relationship with a koan. And so that, there's that. Read a lot of koans and see what lights up for you. Listen to koan talks that are available, online, and see what comes to get you. A koan might drop out of an auspicious cloud and fall on your head and surprise you. And if it does, if there's a wondering in you, what is that? That's, wow, I have no idea what that means, but there's something there I'm really wondering about. Then just begin to spend time with it in the ways that are mentioned in the book, and let it show you. You don't have to figure it out. All you have to do is kind of listen and pay attention and let the koan answer you.
Wonderful. Just a couple more questions that we can get to. Could you speak to the original face koan, another quite famous one?
I love that koan. So the original, how much time do we have?
We have about 8 minutes.
Okay. So the original face koan, it comes from Wei Neng, who was a great teacher in Chinese Buddhism, actually before the age of koans. And the koan is quickly, without thinking right and wrong, before your parents were born, what is your original face? Quickly, without thinking right and wrong, before your parents were born, what is your original face? So one thing is, this koan is a pretty good summary of a great way to work with koans. Okay, quickly, spontaneously. Don't overthink it. Don't spend too much time ruminating about it. But what's your first response? What's your response before you think that you don't know, right? What happens first? Before your parents were born, before the whole mad story of you heaves into existence, before you're locked in your own story and your own psyche and your own thoughts and feelings. Without thinking right and wrong, before the engines of opinion and judgment heave into existence as well. Before all of that, what's left? What's your original face? And one of the ways I think about this koan is, we tend to think of gates as being things that are in front of us and that we're going to walk through. But the original face gate is actually, I think of it as a gate behind us. And it's inviting us to step back into the moment before thinking right and wrong, before having big ideas, before getting involved in the story of the self. When you step back through that gate and you meet the koan in that empty space, what's your original face there? And then when you walk back through that gate into your life and you look around, what is the original face of everything you see? So that's what I would say about that koan.
Yeah, thank you. A question from Brent. How has your experience with koans changed your everyday life?
How many minutes do we have?
5 minutes.
I would have to say that the most profound way it's changed my everyday life is to see that softly glowing world at the same time that I see things in the ordinary way. Right now, I'm looking out my window at the ocean and looking at the trees in between, and there are all the ordinary ways that we see trees and ocean and the deer who've come to eat the flowers in my garden. And then there's this softly glowing quality, this eternal quality, this unbelievably tender quality of all of life. And that has become inescapable. And sometimes when I think about what I would most like to convey, it is that intimacy with the world, that sense of kinship with everything all the time. And it's not dependent on it being a view of trees and deer in the ocean. It's when things are hard too. It's when things are difficult and painful and ununderstandable, as there is so much today that is ununderstandable. There's that same sense of kinship with it, and that same sense of wanting to be in relationship to it, wanting to respond. And so that's, that's the most immediate thing. And then I would say, in terms of a grand vision, there is a Mahayana idea that the universe exists because the universe has taken a vow to exist, that there is a kind of vow of the universe. And then each of us might discover that we have a vow. And that sense of how does our individual vow that we are not enacting, but that we are, what is the vow that I am? What is the vow of the world that I am? How does that relate to, connect to the vow of the universe? How does that become the same thing? And the koans are, for me, the best bridge or connection or metaphor, the way to see both that vow of the universe and the vow of my own life as being continuous with each other. And that sounds kind of philosophical, but it's not. It's kind of how you brush your teeth in the morning. It's everything.
Beautiful. Well, I think that's a nice note to end on. So we'll wrap up there. Thank you so much, Joan, for being here with us and for that wonderful conversation and the readings. Joan's book is Through Forests of Every Color, Awakening with Koans. It's a really wonderful, just insightful and poetic book. And you can pre-order that now. It comes out in around a month, I believe, maybe 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. So highly recommend checking out Joan's book. You can also learn more about her work in the link that is posted in the chat. And we just thank you all so much for being here. If you'd like to support Tricycle with a donation, we're a nonprofit and we really appreciate your support. And we'll post a donate link in the chat box. Thank you so much again, Joan. Thank you for everyone for being here. And keep an eye on your email for the event replay, which we will send out tomorrow.
Thank you, Carolyn, so much for having me. And thank you for your good questions. It was really a pleasure to speak with you today.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.